through this. 2 weeks ago, we did the overview of our method, the OIA Bible Study method, or otherwise known as the Inductive Bible Study. You might be asking, and I said this at the beginning, but it's been a while, why are we studying about how to study the Bible? Because in our moment, in our day, we hear a lot of voices from all different sectors of experts and life coming at us. And we need to listen to that, and we need to hear that, and we need to take it into consideration. But the voice that we need to hear above all is God's voice. God has given us His Word and the 66 books of the Bible to speak through His Spirit into our hearts. And the challenge is that sometimes we may get frustrated when we come to study the Bible. We may find it difficult to get into the Word. And so what I'm trying to do is give you an approach that can really bless you in your walk with Jesus and can help you to deepen your Bible study. You'll probably be asked to do some things that you never really had to do when you came to the Word. And that's okay, right? It's okay to be challenged in this way, to think about different things and to look at new ways to approach the Word. Some of these things that we talk about will be things you've already been doing. Some of them may be different. But I think if you take what you've already been doing and how you've engaged with the Word and add some of these to it that are distinctive, it will bless you in your walk with the Lord. So, the OIA approach is exactly that. It's observation, it's interpretation, and it's application. Now, we may not consciously think about it, but this is what we do every day. When someone says something to you, you hear it, you have the raw material of the words, right? You interpret what those words mean, and then you find how it applies to you. Right? So we do this all the time. We just might not consciously think about it. So OIA, and this part is just reviewed just as a refresher of what we talked about 2 weeks ago. OIA uses inductive reasoning to draw conclusions about the meaning of the Bible passage. So instead of taking a pre-existing idea and bringing it to the Word, we're going to the Word and drawing out what it has to speak to us at that place.
So both are necessary and both can be important, but inductive is trying to say, okay, what is this speaking in this specific text? So observation, the first part is asked, what does the text say? We're not interpreting there. We're not trying to give meaning. We're just saying, what does it say? That's it. One of the challenges, and I think he talks about this in the book that we're using sort of as a guide is The Knowable Word by Peter Kroll. And I chose that because it's really a short and accessible guide to this method of study. But one of the things that he talks about there is one of our challenges, especially for you and I, who have been in the church our whole lives or been in the church for many years, is sometimes our familiarity with the Word. Now, most of the time, the opposite problem is the case. We just don't know the Word. Many people just don't know the Word. They've never read the Bible. They've never studied the Bible. But for many of us who have studied, there's an opposite problem, and we can become so familiar that we overlook things. We miss things. Or we come to a text thinking we already know what it says before we've actually read it again. One thing I've been doing through the study is kind of showing you how this affects me and how I preach to you guys. I don't save sermons. I know of those preachers, and it's fine if they want to do that, who, after 7, 8, 9, 10 years of preaching, they've got quite a archive built up of sermons. They just go back through those old sermons. They just polish the dust off of them and preach it again. I mean, likely people aren't going to know that he preached it 5 years prior or 7 years prior or last week, right? But I don't do that. And one of the reasons I don't do that is because each time I come to a text, even if it's a text I've preached on before, I want to come to it afresh. Now, that doesn't mean I just throw everything I know, but I do try to come to it afresh and say, okay, what does this have to speak now? And so the same with you. When you come to the text, it may be something you've read 100 times. I've read Genesis 1 hundreds of times. And every time I go to it, I still find new insights. It's really amazing. And so for us, that's what observation is. We just want to observe what's there. We're not trying to read into it. We're not trying to interject anything. We just want to read. The second is interpretation. And interpretation asks, what does the text mean? And what is the differences between our culture and theirs? There is a difference between being a 21st century American and being a 6th or 7th or 8th BC Mesopotamian. For one, they didn't drive a Toyota to church. They didn't have churches, right? They had something different. So those are things that interpretation has to try to answer. What are the differences? Now, one thing I said to you guys a couple weeks ago that I'm going to repeat is the text cannot mean what it hasn't meant. Okay? I want you to kind of log that somewhere. The text cannot mean what it has not meant. And what that means is the text cannot mean something completely and entirely different to us than it meant to them. Now, it may look a little different. The application, as we'll get to here in a minute, might look a little different. But there are timeless principles that was the same for them, reading it as an 8th century BC Mesopotamian, right? As there are, living in that region of Mesopotamia, as there are for you and I in 21st century America. And that's what interpretation tries to do, is try to say, okay, what is the timeless principle in this text? And then that gets us to, and we're going to go through these in detail. I'm just kind of overviewing them right now. That gets to application. Application asks, what teaching, what reproof or correction, what training do I get from this passage? If you remember, that's what Paul told Timothy was part of the function of the word, right? It's profitable for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the person of God may be complete for every good work. So application asks, how do I need to be reproved? How do I need to be corrected? Or what training do I need? Application asks, who is God demonstrating himself as in this passage? I put this one in there. I don't think he uses this one in the book. I put this one in here for this reason. For many, many years, I've heard people say, well, I read it and it said this about God, but what does it mean to me? Like, how is it applicable? Well, if you are gaining greater knowledge of God, what more application do you need? When we read the Bible, we might be reading in Exodus and we think, oh, well, this text is about Moses. It's not about Moses. Right? We're reading Job, and we say, oh, this is about Job. It's not about Job. The Bible is about God. Right? The very first beginning of it, in the beginning, God. The Bible is all about who God is, how God relates to his creation, and how his creation relates back to him. That's it. So if you're learning more about God's nature, if you're learning more about how God's relating to his creation, if you're learning more about how his creation is relating back to him, then that is applicable. Even if it doesn't solve my stress for that day, right? Even if it doesn't solve the tension I have at work that day, or this question that I have this any given day, a lot of times that's kind of the lens that we go to the Bible is like, okay, answer my questions. And it answers the big questions that transform us. But just so through trying to draw us into and invite us into life with God. And that gets us to application asks, how should I, or in our context, how should we change? So does anybody have any questions about that? Because we're going to shift, that's kind of the overview. We're going to shift to now how we actually do that. And we're going to start with observation tonight. Yeah, Neil?
The question I have is, where you state that what the Bible says in certain passages, you cannot change the meaning of what it says for us in today's world.
Are you asking a question or are you making a statement?
Well, I'm asking a question
Okay.
of why can you not use text to, like when the letter to the Galatians, or some other letter where they're talking about what they need to do.
Yeah.
Why can't you use that for raising your children?
Oh, you can, and that's where application comes in. The challenge is we don't want to force an application based on our preconceived notions, right? We want the application to come from the text itself, not because I want the text to say something, right? That's the difference. But you're right. I mean, that's what it does no good. I think you've stopped short if, I know what this said. We're studying Isaiah on Sunday morning, going through in the sermon. Well, this was really helpful when when Tiglath-Pileser III was about to invade Israel. Well, that was really helpful to them then. Now, you may understand the message to them in that day, but I think you've missed the point or stopped short if you don't say, well, yeah, that's what that meant, but what does it mean? Right? Now, it can't mean what it never meant, but that's where those timeless principles come in, right? We're not facing Tiglath-Pileser III about to invade our nation. But that doesn't mean there aren't timeless principles there that can speak to our life of faith today. There are. It just takes a little digging sometimes. So yeah, you're right. I mean, that's what we're trying to unearth. That's what we're trying to unpack. But that's why we're going through this. Each one of these steps are important. But if we only do observation and interpretation, and we do no application, then we've kind of missed the point of it. So yeah, that's a great question. Does anybody else have anything before we? All right. So yeah, and this is exactly what you're saying. Application asks, how do I live this passage out? So some people talk about this as an interpretive journey. I'm going to give you a little picture of what that looks like. I know it's kind of small, you can't really see that. But if you look at the top left-hand side, you see that looks a lot like ancient times, right? That's their town. Okay? That's their town, their time. That's what we have when we come to the Bible first, right? We're reading about these ancient kings, these ancient prophets, these ancient people. So we're trying to move from their town to our town. You look on the right-hand side, and that looks like a modern city. Well, how we do that is observation, interpretation, and application. So the river measurement just says, if you look in the middle here, it's like culture, language, covenant, like all those types of things are there in the middle. Language, time, situation, covenant. It's just saying, how do we bridge the gap between their time and our time? And that's what interpretation does, so that we can get to the application and how it applies to us. So it's just I just found it a helpful little, Duvall and Hayes, they wrote a really good textbook on this called Grasping God's Word. And I thought it was a really helpful little visual for what we're trying to do. We're going on a journey. And we're starting in the ancient times and we're bringing it to our time so we know how to be changed and what God wants to speak to us in our day, in our moment. So let's begin. Does anybody have any other questions about the overview before we get into the actual nitty-gritty of how to do observation? Has anyone already read ahead and read some of this in this section? Yeah, some of you probably finished the whole book. Okay. Well, let's, some of you nod your heads. Let's go ahead and get into this. And if you have some questions that came about during your reading as they come up, then we'll try to address that. But we said 2 weeks ago that observation asks the 5 W's and the H, right? Who, what, when, where, why, how. Observation is just asking questions, just listening, just looking at the text. And so in the book on page 21, he said, before we set our eyes on the horizon, we have to get our noses in the text. Before we set our eyes on the horizon, We have to get our noses in the text. Now, what's he talking about there? Well, he says here, our study must begin with observation. When we observe, this is page 21, we try to figure out what the text says, not what we want it to say, think it should say, or heard someone else say about it. We receive each text on its own terms, and that process requires careful observation. So there are different things we're observing when we're looking at the text. One of them is we want to know where this book occurs. So we're studying 1 Peter. Is 1 Peter in the Old Testament or is it in the New Testament? New Testament, right? Yay! Yeah, I wish I had gold star. Yeah, Earl, yeah, I'll give you a gold star. Yeah. I didn't bring some to class. Yeah, that's right. That's right. You start off with a win. So we want to overview, one, observe where does the book occur, okay? You may or may not know this, most likely you do, but the Bible is a library that's laid out based on its genre. So in the New Testament, you have all the Gospels together, right? Then you have Acts. Then you have the letters of Paul. Then you have some of the other epistles or letters. And then you have Revelation, which is an apocalyptic book. It's important to know where the book occurs. Why would that be important? Why is it important to know, as Earl rightly said, that 1 Peter is in the New Testament as opposed to the Old Testament? Yeah, Bob. Okay, right. So as Christians, we are living on this side of the cross, and we need to know that this book or this letter, I'm giving a little bit away, but we already know that. This letter is going to address things that pertain to our life together. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting when you try to study the Bible with people, how little people know. They don't understand the separation between old and new.
Sure.
I mean, and it's in like in 95% of cases I've had experience, they don't really understand.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, if you're reading Leviticus and you're looking at some of these laws and you're like, wait a second, am I supposed to be doing all this stuff? Wait, I ate shrimp for lunch. Am I supposed to? I didn't eat shrimp, but I'm just saying, am I supposed to be doing that? I had bacon for breakfast. Am I supposed to be doing? I mean, you don't understand the changes and the things that have happened since then, right? Understanding where the book occurs helps to give it a proper context. And I want to give you a paragraph that most likely won't make much sense to you. A newspaper is better than a magazine. A seashore is a better place than the street. At first, it is better to run than to walk. You may have to try several times. It takes some skill, but it is easy to learn. Even young children can enjoy it. Birds seldom get too close. Rain, however, soaks in very fast. One needs lots of room. If there is no complications, it can be very peaceful. A rock will serve as an anchor. If things break loose from it, however, you will not get a second chance. Now, does that make any sense to anybody?
What's a newspaper?
Yeah, exactly, right? Now, it's pretty nonsensical if you just read it on its own, because it's like, well, I mean, I kind of know what some of that means, but how does all that relate, or does it relate? But what if before I had you read this, I showed you a picture of this? It's a little child flying a newspaper kite. Give some context, right? Now let's go back to the paragraph. A newspaper is better than a magazine. Right? A newspaper will work to fly a kite. A magazine will not. A seashore is a better place than the street. You do not want to be flying a kite in the street. At first, it is better to run than to walk. Why is that? Because it'll never get off the ground if you don't, right? You may have to try several times. Usually it takes me a good 15, 20 minutes to finally get it right before I get the kite up in the air. It takes some skill, but it's easy to learn. Even young children can enjoy it. And you saw it from the picture. Birds seldom get too close. Rain, however, soaks in very fast because it's newspaper. One needs lots of room. If there are no complications, it can be very peaceful. A rock will serve as an anchor. Things break loose from it, however, you will not get a second chance because the kite will fly away. Having that one key piece of information made all the rest of that make sense, didn't it? You have to have context. And that's one of the things as we look at the Bible, and when we're going through these books, it's so easy to misconstrue what a passage is saying because we're not looking at the context. Where does the book occur? What is the book about? What is the book, why is Peter writing this letter? All those kinds of things can be helpful in putting all those pieces together so that they make sense. So, we already said that. So there are three primary contexts that we can look at. There's more, but three primary for the book itself. I'm not talking about the context of a specific passage like I have written on the board here. I'm talking about just the book. Canonical means where its place in the Bible, or also is in the New Testament, right? It's in the letters, it's in the general epistles. So knowing where it is, canonical, canon just means, it's a Greek word from canon, which just means a reed or like a measuring stick. So knowing where it's at helps you. Historical context. We're reading 1 Peter. I hope you guys took time, you guys and lady took time to read through those first 9 verses over and over and over again. You see, he talks about suffering. Right? You're going to have trials and temptations. Why is he talking about that? Well, what's the historical context happening there? Well, this is occurring this book was written around 63 or 64 AD. This was right on the cusp of when Nero was about to blame the Christians for burning down most of Rome. He did it himself because he wanted to build Rome how he wanted it to be. But he needed a scapegoat, and he chose the Christians. So this was the first real targeted persecution of Christians on a widespread scale. This is when Peter's writing this letter. It makes a lot of sense when you read the letter, what he's saying, and why this would be helpful when you understand what was going on in the historical context. And then redemptive. And this gets to what Bob was talking about, when we know that as Christians we're reading this in the New Testament, and this has something to speak about our life as the redeemed people. So whereas if we're reading in the book of Judges, we know that the redemptive history is at a very different place. Or in Genesis chapter 3, we see the beginning of why we need a redemptive history, right? Or you're looking in Isaiah and they're talking about this remnant that's going to be redeemed, which is very important to understanding the New Testament. I mean, all these contexts are really, really important. So to set the context, there's 5 things. He talks about this, I think, in the book. The author. 1 Peter helps us so much with this because what's the first word? Peter, right? So we know Peter wrote this or had someone write it while he was dictating to him, either one. So we know the author. We also know the audience because in verse 1 it says, to those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So who's the audience? Well, it's these scattered churches, these scattered people among these regions. The occasion I just kind of talked about. Now, it doesn't mention Nero by name in here, but we can read it and understand that there is pressure and persecution that's being placed on the Christians when you read the whole book. And I only asked you to read the first 9 verses, but usually before you get into studying it in detail, you want to read the whole book at least a couple times. It's a little easier when you have 5 or 6 chapters as opposed to something like Psalms or Isaiah or Ezekiel or something like that. But reading through the whole book, well, and then when you go back to those individual passages, you can kind of see where it's leading, what's going on. And that's part of the theme, the structure, and then the purpose. We want to look for what's the purpose of this book? Why is this author writing this book? Now, admittedly, some of these books are easier to know the author and audience than others. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, I'm writing to these churches. Genesis, probably Moses. Perhaps writing to Israel or to the Hebrews after they had come out of Egypt. We don't know. But we can know something, right? And whatever we can know will help us to understand better and better. Does anybody have any questions about this before we move ahead? Is this something that you have thought about in your study of the Word prior to today? I see a couple shaking no. Why haven't you thought about what? Yeah.
Why haven't I thought about
Yeah.
it?
Why haven't you said?
We read it.
Yeah, you said you haven't done this really before. You know, when you were studying the Word, what it, you know.
To be honest with you, when I didn't totally understand something, a lot of times I would go to the commentary.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
look and see what they thought.
Right.
But no, to be honest, truth, a lot of this does make my head explode.
Yeah, it's just new, right? It's just new information.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it takes some dedication.
Right.
It takes some work.
Right.
It takes a lot of concentration, a lot of, at least for me anyhow. I'm
Yeah,
speaking
no,
about
it is
me.
for all of us,
It's,
yeah.
it's a due diligence process.
Sure.
To do all of this.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It takes time, right? It takes a little focus. But is the Word worth that? Yeah, I think so. Of course it is.
With me, I always started at number 5.
The purpose, right? Yeah. Well, because that's what's most readily appealing. We really don't want to go through all that. We just want to know, what does it say to me so I can go on my way, right? But if we don't go through this process, we're likely to misunderstand or misrepresent or distort what it actually has to say to us. Yeah, I mean, all of us, right? I mean, like, I'm reading this, I'm like, yeah, all these places, all these names. Just what do I need to know? Let me get on. Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah, the Cliff Notes. Give me the shorthand version, right? But as we go through this, it's not going to be easy. And maybe not all these things you will find as applicable. If you do all of this, it will greatly bless you. But even if you don't do everything, what you do add and contribute will just make your study even much more valuable and understanding. So we kind of already talked about this a little bit. What is the context for 1 Peter? Well, this is really interesting terminology right here. Those who reside as aliens. What is an alien? Besides the green people from space. What is Peter talking about there?
Not natives.
Okay. So these are people who are residing as non-natives. And then the next word, scattered. Now, we don't know, just from reading that, what scattered them. We will know as we read the letter. But we can already, just from this first line, really, I mean, this is just, him addressing his name and his title, like we would do. Dear Susie, right? It's Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. It's kind of the same thing. So turn this around a little bit so you can see. But even from this first line, we can already tell something of what the letter is going to be about. And we can already begin to glean some insights. We haven't interpreted anything. We're just making an observation, right? We're just observing what it says. but we already know that it's going to address a people who aren't in their homeland, who have been scattered by some sort of external force. And that's going to be really important. It's going to be really important. So we'll talk about this in 2 weeks, but 5 things to observe from a passage. And I'm actually going to illustrate how to do that. All right, I'm not just going to say, hey, go do it. We'll talk about how to do some of those things. Some of them are easier than others, but he talks about this in the book, the 5 things to observe from a passage: genre, words, grammar, structure, and mood. But as we do each of these, and some of those words sound much scarier than they really are. When we talk about the genre, we've already said it. What genre is 1 Peter? What type of book is it? Is it a book at all? It's a letter, right? That's genre. That's it. So it's a big word that's really just something simple. It's a letter. So we're not going to read 1 Peter the same way we would read the Psalms. What are the Psalms? Poetry. Right? Yeah, songs are poetry. You don't read a song from the hymn book the same way you read a letter that was sent from a cousin of yours, right? You read them differently. Well, that also helps in the mood on the 5th part of that. The mood of a letter is very different than the mood of a song or mood of a poem. So we'll talk about how to kind of look at that and do that. And as you kind of put these into your study time and your practice, they'll become more second nature to you, and you won't even think about it. You'll just look at it and already pick up on some of this. But does anybody have any final questions or thoughts tonight before we close?
What about
Translations.
translations?
What's your question about translations? Yeah. What are you asking about? That's a great question. That could be a whole class. I almost did a class on that, but I'd already belabored the point. No. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of that. The majority of our modern English translations are really good. The thing about translations is that they can never really capture fully all of the words in their fullness in one translation, or they'd be unreadable. Okay. So it's good to compare translations, but there are some translations that are more accurate to the actual words in the original languages. So, the Bible is written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And the Old Testament is Hebrew, Aramaic, New Testament, Greek. There is an Old Testament translation that's in Greek that's actually older than our oldest Hebrew. That's another story as well. But what they do is some of them are translating it, trying to preserve every single word as closely as possible. Some translations try to preserve the thought behind the words that are in the original. Both of them have their merits, but I tend to prefer those that try to capture the words as they are in the original. So I use the New American Standard, the most accurate that we have in contemporary English. Probably the most accurate is the American Standard, but it preserves the archaisms that are in the King James, right? So this has the these, thous, and that kind of thing. And most modern readers can't read that, can't understand that, because we don't speak in 16th century Elizabethan English. So the New American Standard, the English Standard, the King James Version, New King James Versions, the American Standard, they're probably the ones that try to capture word for word as closely as possible. Then you have the Message, which is a paraphrase based on the translation. That's the opposite extreme. And then you have the NIV, which is kind of in between both of them, or the New Living Translation, which is a little more further thought for thought. Right. Does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Yeah,
when I'm doing this kind of Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. When I'm doing this kind of study, I want a New American Standard or an English Standard. I want something that's as close as possible. When I'm just reading casually, New Living Translation or whatever, it's just fine. It's just my personal opinion on that. But whatever translation you use, most likely it's a good one. So it'll be fine. Yeah, Bob?
I've heard the Living Bible being referred
The Living Bible was originally a paraphrase, I think based on the King James Version. The guy wrote it for his kids. He wanted to read the Bible to his kids. His kids couldn't understand. I think that's how that came about. Kids couldn't understand the King James Version, so he wrote it in contemporary language so that his kids could understand. And that's an admirable thing.
Can you compare that to your other scriptures, though?
Yeah, and it can be, and some of those I do use more like a commentary, right? They can be, but it is good to compare translations. All right. Thank you all for being here. We're dismissed.